Okay, aloha everybody. This is just a very quick video lecture uh, on Stewart Firth's article, Sovereignty and Independence in the Contemporary Pacific. You see here a map of French Polynesia. I put that map up here because it represents one of the several uh, statuses that Pacific Island groups have. In this case, a colony, hence the French in French Polynesia. But when we say Tahiti, usually we're talking about this larger island group of French Polynesia, including the Marquesas, Tuamotus, and so on. So I made here a chart of all the different statuses that Pacific islands have. Territories is probably not a good word because some of these island groups are actually territories. So let's look through this from the left. 3 colonies: French Polynesia, which we just looked at, Wallis and Futuna, small island group, which is a French colony, and then New Caledonia. So France is one of the few countries that's held on to its colonies in the Pacific. Most of the other Pacific islands have gained at least some measure of sovereignty, full sovereignty, or a sort of partial sovereignty, which we'll talk about. But France has held on to colonies. In New Caledonia, there was an independence struggle, and I kind of regret we haven't been able to do more on the French, like Tahiti, because a lot of the videos and materials are in French. So you see all the colonies there in that column are all France. Free association in the second column, that's a status that I sometimes refer to as independence with strings attached. When we talk about Micronesia, Micronesia is an anthropological grouping which is equivalent to Polynesia and Melanesia. So when we say Micronesia, in Hawaii you talk about Micronesians as if they're from one country, but they're actually from 3 countries, which are in a status that we call a compact of free association with the United States. So that's why it says US there. They're sort of semi-sovereignty. So here's how I usually refer to it. It's sovereignty with strings attached, although we'll see in the end here that Stewart Firth wouldn't really agree with that assessment. So what are the 3 countries? The Federated States of Micronesia. So certain islands within that country are considered states. For example, Yap. Yap is a state within the Federated States of Micronesia. The Marshall Islands is a country on its own, a free association country. So that is Kwajalein, Majuro, and Bikini Atoll. Those are part of the Marshall Islands country. And then the third country is the Republic of Palau or Belau. There's 2 ways of saying it. So all of those are in free association. So what does that mean? It means that the U.S. grants almost all of the rights of a sovereign state to these islands. For example, they're members of the United Nations, but the strings attached are that the United States has the ability to build up unlimited military facilities in those countries. There also seems to be some kind of tie in the United Nations where the free association states always vote with the United States. So often you have votes in the U.S. where it's in the UN where it's every country in the world versus United States, those 3 Micronesian countries, and Israel. So it's not 1 against 192. It's like 188 versus 5, so it looks more like there's a coalition, but really those 3 Micronesian states seem to be beholden to the U.S. to vote with them in the UN. That's one of the strings attached. Now that seems to be unofficial, but that's my reading of it. And then another free association grouping is the Cook Islands. Just a current event on them. They're talking about changing their name to not have the island group based on the name based on being discovered, so-called discovered by Cook, but more of a native name. Islands in the Cook Islands include Aitutaki and other islands. So those are sort of semi-sovereign, semi-territories, meaning they're in between a full sovereign and a territory. So let's look at the territory column, the third column. Guam is a U.S. territory. Guam anthropologically is part of Micronesia, so culturally they're Micronesian. Ethnically, Chamorro are the natives, but there's a lot of Filipino people in Guam or who have intermarried. There's also Spanish colonizing before the U.S., so there's some Spanish connection there. But Guam is anthropologically part of Micronesia, the largest island in Micronesia, but politically it's a territory of the U.S. So, for example, the high schools in Guam are John F. Kennedy High School, George Washington High School, things like that. So this sort of semi-colonial, similar to what you see here with Roosevelt and McKinley High School. American Samoa, that is half of the Samoa group. I believe the island of Savaii is American Samoa. Not just one island, but a few of the islands, and then there's the other part of Samoa, which is in the far right column. And then Tokelau is a territory of New Zealand. So you notice New Zealand has a free association island group, and then also a territory group. Federated state, meaning a state like the state of California within a federation. That's the United States. Hawaii, and I put a question mark there for the reasons that were covered in the other lecture. Oh, so I also put Hawaii in the far right column, again with a question mark, because that is the debatable point covered in that lecture and the reading. And then it doesn't say parentheses US on that side, because if it's sovereign, then it's not. As Firth wrote in his piece, there's no connection between the constitution of a sovereign state and the constitution of any other state. We'll get to that, more of that later. So in the sovereign side, I put Samoa first because that is the other part of Samoa group, which used to be called Western Samoa. So you used to have the territory of American Samoa and the sovereign country of Western Samoa, but they didn't really like the idea of just being Western, just the Western part. So they said, no, we're Samoa. So they changed the name long after they had sovereignty to just Samoa. Tonga is sovereign. If any of these countries have remained sovereign, putting Hawaii aside for the moment, it's Tonga. Now, Tonga was a protectorate of Britain from 1900 until 1970, and in 1970 they became part of the British Commonwealth. Commonwealth countries are really independent countries, and Tonga. The thing about Tonga is that it never lost its monarch, so the monarchy is unbroken. Papua New Guinea was another early sovereign country to gain sovereignty in the 60s. So the first was Samoa in 1964. I don't remember the exact date of independence for Papua New Guinea, but it's I think that's the correct order there. And then Vanuatu, it's a sovereign state. It had been colonized by both Britain and France, but gained independence. I'm thinking these countries were talking around 1975 by this point. Fiji, I think Fiji was 1975, gained sovereignty, breaking away from Britain. And if you ever see this, the Fijian flag, it has a Union Jack in the corner, just as the Hawaiian flag does, and the Australian flag, and the New Zealand flag. So Fiji is kind of like part of that British heritage politically. The next one is pronounced Kiribati. It used to be called the Gilbert Islands. Very small sovereign state. Now we're getting here into sovereign countries that are smaller than Hawaii, like much smaller, and yet they still have the status of sovereignty. So sovereignty is not about size of your population. They're not about your size of your territory. They're not about the size of your economy. It's simply a political status. And you can have it even when you're very small. I think my favorite point illustrating that is that the sovereign country of Monaco, which is kind of like in France, but sovereign, is smaller than Hilo. So there are sovereign countries smaller than Hawaii. Kiribati and the next one, Nauru, would be examples of that. So moving on to Nauru. Nauru is an interesting case where they basically sold their islands for the mining rights to a German company, and they mined what's called guano there. It's basically bird droppings, but it's valuable because it's used to make fertilizer, or at least it used to be used for that. So Nauru was paid a pretty huge sum for those rights, and most people from there don't live there anymore. And that's a whole other story. It's sort of like a scenario, like if you have the ability to get sovereignty, what can you do with it? The people of Nauru, being so small, and decided to do that and sell off the mining rights, which basically destroyed the island for the most part, but gave them the ability to have some financial resources. And actually they own 2 buildings next to Ala Moana shopping center. That's sort of like the sovereignty of Nauru now, is in those buildings. I think one of the TV stations is in this building. Solomon Islands, that's a Melanesian country, independent. Maybe we're talking 1980 by this point. And then again, question mark on Hawaii. So this is an interesting map to think about Hawaii. Out of all these statuses that it could have, and which one does it have, which one could it have in the future. Incidentally, I got an email from the CEO of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs a couple of years ago asking me if I had done any research on free association, because between the CEO and the trustees of OHA, they had been arguing about Hawaii's status. Which kind of status should they support? Because there's one more not on this chart, and that is nation within a nation. And if anyone's interested in that, I can send another lecture that I've done on that question of, you might call it domestic dependent sovereignty. That could be a 6th column here, but there are no groups in the Pacific that have that status. That status is only held by Native American tribes in the U.S. and Canada. So think about the Navajo and the Sioux, the Lakota, and so on. They are domestic dependent, sovereign in quotes. They're internally somewhat sovereign, but not externally. So they're not full sovereign states. Okay, that's enough on that chart. Moving on, just as an example of the Guam situation, the territorial status. The English professor, who I just learned was made full professor in the English department at UH Manoa, Craig Santos Perez, he wrote a book called a poetry book called From Unincorporated Territory. And so in the territorial status, you have 2 types of territories: incorporated, so American Samoa is incorporated, and Guam is unincorporated. It's similar to the process that cities or towns go through when they become incorporated. So incorporated means you're a corporation or in a corporal body, um, meaning you are a political entity that has its own government in a sense. And even though Guam does have a governor, it has not gone through the process of becoming incorporated. So in that book, I just have an example here of one of his poems. He's got these words that have significance for the Chamorro from Guam. So Guam is actually a Western way of saying the name. In the indigenous language, it's Guahan, and then there's different ways to say it. So he has got these words here, these names. But if you look at the poem, the way it's arranged on the page, it creates the shape of the island of Guam. And so that's his kind of statement. It's a sort of a protest statement against Guam, the way Guam's treated as a territory. The same was true in Hawaii. When Hawaii was a territory from 1900 to 1959, territories, the citizens of territories are very much second-class citizens, and that's not really debatable. It's a reason for the drive towards statehood in Hawaii. I showed this map here because it color codes somewhat the political statuses of the different island groups. So you see TO, NU, NU, by the way, that's Niue. Niue is a very, very, very small island that is technically sovereign. But more importantly, so you see the different statuses there. New Caledonia as a colony, French Polynesia. That's PF is French Polynesia in French. But anyway, what this map really made me think about was a teacher at Kamehameha who started to have the students study their own, from their own perspective, meaning as Pacific Islanders, because for the most part, we still don't really do that. So he started a whole 4-year track where you can take all your English studying Hawaiian Pacific literature instead of reading Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and Shakespeare. You do some of that. It's called Hawaii Pacific World. So you're seeing yourself as, and we see Hawaii here at the very, very top, almost like cut off. That's like a metaphor for Hawaii's not really being included as a Pacific island group. And that's relevant for us being a class about the Asia Pacific. What is that formation called the Pacific? Is Hawaii even part of it? Well, obviously it is, but in the consciousness, it often isn't, not just among Hawaiians or people in Hawaii, but by Pacific Islanders. They don't invite us to the Pacific Island Games. Until the very most recent one, Hawaii was invited but didn't attend. We're working on that. So this English teacher, who's actually a well-known poet named Richard Hamasaki, he had a lesson where he would give the students this map blank with no name markers. No, sorry. First he would give them a map of the United States, and he would have them fill out states, and most of them could fill out at least half of the states, if not 3/4. And by the time they're juniors, they have to get all 50, 100%. And then he'd give them the map of the Pacific blank, and most of them couldn't even name one single island group in the Pacific. And that really, really makes a point, which is you're in the Pacific and you don't even know where you are. So I think it's good that we're going over this reading because it gives us a framework with which to think about the political formations in the Pacific. So on the last column of our chart, you have sovereign states. What is sovereignty? According to Alan James, I think quoted in Firth, constitutional independence, a supremacy derived from an absence of constitutional ties to another state. And that's the definition by which he uses to critique free association. We'll get to in a minute. A more conservative or traditional definition can be seen in Black's Law Dictionary: the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power by which any independent state is governed. And it goes on and on with a lot of use of the words supreme and paramount. So it's in the old school way of thinking about sovereignty. Sovereignty is kind of absolute, that the sovereign can do whatever they will. It's a pretty old school way where the law is the will of the sovereign, meaning the king for the most part. I put New Zealand and Australia in with a question mark because New Zealand and Australia still have as their head of state the Queen of England. So they're interesting cases because they're actually sovereign. They're members of the UN. They act in every way as sovereign countries, but they're not legally sovereign because they have a connection to another state, that is the United Kingdom. And so it's in a way it's the opposite of Hawaii, because Hawaii, if my argument in the previous lecture is correct, Hawaii is legally sovereign but not actually sovereign. It doesn't act as a sovereign state in really any way. But if there was no annexation due to no treaty, then Hawaii is legally sovereign. So New Zealand and Australia are kind of the opposite in that sense. Some quotes that kind of illustrate, and just to tie up, finish up this train of thought. Here's the critique from Firth of free association. Although the freely associated states have sometimes been said to possess sovereignty, they do not. And he makes that argument going back to Alan James's definition of sovereignty, because there's a connection between the Constitution of the federated of the Micronesian countries to the United States Constitution. That means they're not actually sovereign. Next quote by Firth himself: different Pacific territories have been of different strategic values to external states. I'll touch on that in a minute. Generally, the greater the strategic value of an island territory, the less likely that territory has been to proceed to sovereign status. So you may have seen this quote in the reading, but I wanted to highlight it because it kind of summarizes his argument. That's his core argument, that why do they have these 5 different political statuses? Because the larger global powers see different values among the different Pacific island groups. And so actually the sovereign island groups, such as Tonga, are the ones with very little strategic value. And the ones that are fully incorporated, like Hawaii, arguably, Micronesia to a less extent, or colonies, the French colonies, are of higher strategic value. So what are these values? What are some examples? Well, in Hawaii, obviously Pearl Harbor. Best port in the Pacific, a deep water harbor, strategically located in the center of the Pacific. A lot of people don't know. The same is true with American Samoa. It's got a deep water harbor pretty central in the South Pacific, whereas the western part of Samoa doesn't have any such harbor, no strategic value. So they took American Samoa, the eastern part of Samoa, but not the western part. Tonga, on the other hand, having lived there, I know well that they have tried over many, many decades to develop some kind of economic industry that would bring a measure of wealth, development to the country, and that's been a huge struggle. They don't have a harbor, they don't have really arable land, they don't have any industries. The number one export when I was there was dried coconut. It's not a huge industry. And then after I left, they developed pumpkins. they found that pumpkins grow well there. Well, that's good, but there's not a huge market for pumpkins. It's not like petroleum or something like that. And so Tonga has been left to its own devices, so it's independent because of its lack of value. To go back to Hawaiian history, there's a very famous quote from David Malo that sort of summarizes all of this and is a good way to end with a way of thinking about it. Malo said in the 1830s, "If a big wave comes in, large and unfamiliar fishes will come from the dark ocean, and when they see the small fishes of the shallows, they will eat them up." David Malo, I may or may not have mentioned, is, in my view, the greatest Hawaiian scholar. He's the first Hawaiian scholar in the Western tradition, the first one to write down Hawaiian traditions in a sort of an anthropological approach. He was a historian to a lesser extent. So Malo could see this back in the very early days. And I bolded the words unfamiliar fishes because there's actually a famous book on the New York Times bestseller list by Sarah Vowell, kind of a popular historian, called Unfamiliar Fishes, where she sees the irony in all of this, what we've just talked about, including in the previous quote by Firth. So I think this reading has been a good way to encapsulate the larger issues within the Pacific, not Asia so much, but why different groups have different political statuses. And I hope it's working out that it's a shorter lecture because we're getting towards the end of the class when you need to be putting a lot of time in your research papers. So I'll end it there, and that's it for now, we hope.